Imagine a man standing alone in a crowded marketplace, his gaze fixed on the ground, his shoulders slumped, his mind consumed by the sting of rejection. The voices around him blur into a haunting echo, words of criticism, accusations, reminders of his perceived failures. He feels exposed, vulnerable, as if the entire world has witnessed his humiliation. But in that moment he remembers the teachings of Epictetus, the Stoic philosopher who rose from slavery to wisdom. It's not what happens to you, but how you respond to it that matters, Epictetus taught, urging his students to distinguish between what is within their control and what is not. The man takes a deep breath, straightens his posture, and whispers to himself, "I am not defined by their opinions. I control my response." For the Stoics, rejection was not a verdict but a test, a challenge to remain unmoved by the judgments of others, to anchor oneself in the certainty of inner worth rather than the fleeting approval of the crowd. Epictetus likened the mind to a fortress, a stronghold that could not be breached unless one willingly opened the gates. He warned against allowing the opinions of others to enter that fortress, urging his students to protect their peace with the vigilance of a guard standing watch. "If someone speaks ill of you," he said, "remember that he does so from his own perspective, not from yours." The Stoic must learn to detach, to step back from the sting of rejection and observe it with the calm detachment of a wise sage. It is not the insult that harms, but the meaning one attaches to it. The man, still standing in the marketplace, now lifts his head. The words that once cut deep now pass through him like a breeze, leaving no mark. He remembers that to the Stoic, rejection is not a punishment, but a training ground. A chance to practice the art of inner calm. A chance to prove that while the world may reject him, he will never reject himself. Seneca once wrote, "What is to be feared is not the pain, but the failure to endure it." Imagine a man sitting alone in a dimly lit room, his hands clasped tightly together, his heart heavy with the weight of failure. The echoes of his mistakes ring in his mind like a haunting refrain. Each misstep a blow to his confidence, each setback a reminder of what he could have been but was not. He feels like a man drowning in the ocean, struggling to keep his head above water as the waves of self-doubt crash over him. But Seneca, who faced exile, betrayal, and the threat of execution, understood that failure was not the end, but the beginning, a crucible in which character was forged. "We suffer more in imagination than in reality," he said, urging his followers to confront their fears, to look failure in the eye and ask, "Is this truly as bad as I imagine it to be?" Seneca taught that the Stoic must learn to see failure not as a verdict but as a lesson, a teacher disguised as hardship, a guide dressed as defeat. To the Stoic, failure is a mirror reflecting the weaknesses that must be addressed, the gaps that must be closed, the illusions that must be shattered. Seneca advised his students to practice voluntary discomfort, to expose themselves to hardship deliberately, to rehearse failure mentally so that when real failure struck, they would be ready, unshaken, and composed. "Set aside a certain number of days," he said, "during which you shall be content with the scantiest and cheapest fare, saying to yourself all the while, 'Is this the condition that I feared?'" This exercise was not about suffering for suffering's sake, but about training the mind to endure, to remain calm amidst chaos, to rise above the sting of failure and see it for what it truly was, a fleeting moment, a passing wave, a temporary setback that could not break a mind fortified by Stoic principles. The man in the room unclenches his hands, takes a deep breath, and whispers to himself, "I am not defined by my failures, but by how I rise from them." In that moment, he realizes that failure is not a wall, but a doorway, not a sentence, but a question that asks, "Will you rise again?" And in the silence of that room, he finds his answer. Epictetus, a man who rose from the chains of slavery to the heights of Stoic wisdom, knew that setbacks were not curses but crucibles, opportunities to forge inner strength and cultivate unbreakable resolve. Difficulties are things that show what men are, he said, reminding his students that life's true test was not in moments of comfort but in moments of challenge when the world seemed to crumble beneath their feet. Imagine a man who has just lost everything, his job, his reputation, his sense of purpose. He stands alone in the rain, his clothes soaked through, his eyes heavy with despair. The world looks at him and sees a failure, a man who has fallen from grace, a man whose best days are behind him. But Epictetus would see something else. He would see a man at the crossroads of choice, a man standing before the opportunity to rebuild himself from the ground up. What upsets people, he said, is not things themselves but their judgments about these things. Epictetus believed that the Stoic must learn to step back from setbacks, to detach from the sting of failure, to strip away the emotion and see the event as it truly is. An event, a circumstance, a moment in time that holds no inherent power except that which one gives to it. You are not what has happened to you, he said. You are what you choose to become. The Stoic path was not about avoiding setbacks, but about using them as a training ground, a place to practice self-control, patience, and perseverance. Epictetus advised his students to expect setbacks, to prepare for them, to mentally rehearse the worst that could happen, and to ask themselves, if this happens, will it destroy me? Will it shatter my resolve? Will it rob me of my will to rise again? In this practice, known as premeditatio malorum, the Stoic inoculates himself against despair, preparing the mind for life's inevitable storms so that when they arrive, he is not caught off guard but stands ready, firm, and unbroken. The man in the rain lifts his head, his jaw set, his eyes fierce. He may have lost everything, but he has not lost himself. And in that moment, he understands that the storm was never the enemy. It was the teacher, the forge, the crucible in which the man he is meant to become is being forged. One setback, one rejection, one failure at a time. Seneca once said, "A gem cannot be polished without friction, nor a man perfected without trials." Imagine a man who has just been publicly humiliated, his reputation dragged through the mud, his dignity shattered before the eyes of those he once called friends. The whispers follow him everywhere, each one a dagger to the heart, each glance a reminder of what he once was but no longer is. He feels exposed, vulnerable, stripped of all the layers that once protected him. But Seneca, a man who endured exile, disgrace, and the constant threat of execution, knew that humiliation was not the end but a beginning, a chance to redefine oneself, to rise from the ashes of shame as a man forged by fire. What need is there to weep over parts of life? He asked. The whole of it calls for tears. Seneca taught that the Stoic must learn to embrace every trial as a necessary chapter in the story of their life, that setbacks and rejections were not curses but crucibles in which the soul was tempered, strengthened, and refined. The Stoic does not curse the friction. He welcomes it, knowing that it is the very pressure that will polish him into the gem he is destined to become. Seneca advised his students to see every loss as a test, every insult as an opportunity to practice self-restraint, every slight as a chance to practice detachment. We suffer more in imagination than in reality, he said, urging his followers to separate their perception of the event from the event itself, to strip away the emotion and see the event for what it truly was. A moment, a circumstance, a fleeting instance that held no power except that which they chose to give it. The man still standing amidst the ruins of his reputation takes a deep breath and closes his eyes. The whispers fade into the background, The stairs lose their sting, and in the silence of his own mind, he hears Seneca's voice, a calm and steady reminder that the opinions of others are like passing winds. They come and go, but his character remains his own. The greatest obstacle to living is expectancy, which hangs upon tomorrow and loses today, Seneca wrote, urging his students to live fully in the present, to act with virtue regardless of what others said or did, to anchor themselves in the only thing they could control, their own mind. The man straightens his back, lifts his chin, and walks forward, no longer a man defined by what has been lost, but a man strengthened by what remains. His integrity, his courage, his unbreakable resolve. Epictetus, once a slave whose leg was shattered by a cruel master, understood that suffering was not a punishment, but a crucible in which the soul was forged. "What is it that ruins people?" he asked, his eyes fierce, his voice unwavering. "Not events, but their judgments about them. Imagine a man sitting alone in a dark room, his leg bound in splints, his body aching, his spirit weary. The pain radiates through him like a relentless tide, each wave crashing against his resolve, threatening to break him. But Epictetus, lying there in the silence, refuses to surrender. Instead of cursing his fate, he begins to ask himself a question that will change the course of his life. Is my suffering truly unbearable, or have I merely convinced myself that it is? For Epictetus, the key to enduring pain was not to escape it, but to reframe it. To see suffering as a test of character, a trial that could either crush him or strengthen him, depending on how he chose to perceive it. "We cannot choose our circumstances," he said, "but we can always choose how we respond to them." Epictetus taught that every setback, every rejection, every moment of suffering was an opportunity to practice self-control, to fortify the mind against the blows of fate, to rise above the pain and find a place of inner calm where nothing could touch him. He called this practice the art of detachment, the ability to step back from one's own suffering and observe it without judgment, to treat pain as an indifferent observer would, without assigning to it the power to harm. "When someone acts badly toward you," he said, "remember that he is doing or saying what seems right to him." The Stoic does not react. He responds. The Stoic does not curse the pain. He embraces it as a teacher, a guide, a fire that burns away the impurities of the soul and reveals the steel within. The man in the dark room closes his eyes, takes a deep breath, and whispers to himself, "This too shall pass." In that moment, the pain does not disappear, but its hold on him loosens. The suffering no longer defines him. It refines him, and as the night stretches on, he lies there, unbroken, unyielding, and at peace, a man who has learned to see suffering not as a curse, but as a calling, a summons to rise, to endure, to transcend. Seneca, the statesman who walked the dangerous corridors of Nero's court, knew that setbacks were inevitable, but how one responded to them was a matter of choice. "No man is more unhappy than he who never faces adversity," he wrote, "for he is not permitted to prove himself. Imagine a man standing on the edge of a cliff, the wind howling around him, the ground crumbling beneath his feet. Behind him lies the wreckage of his dreams, the shattered remains of all he once pursued. He has been betrayed, abandoned, rejected by those he trusted most. But instead of falling into despair, he remembers Seneca's words, that adversity is not a punishment but a test, a crucible in which the soul is forged and refined." Seneca believed that life was not meant to be easy, that suffering was not a curse but a necessary trial that revealed one's true character. "A gem cannot be polished without friction, nor a man perfected without trials," he said, urging his students to welcome hardship as an opportunity to practice resilience, to rise above their circumstances and emerge stronger than before. For Seneca, setbacks were not to be feared but embraced, for they stripped away illusions and exposed the truth of who a person truly was. He advised his followers to practice voluntary discomfort, to expose themselves to small hardships, cold baths, simple meals, solitary walks, to build the mental armor that would protect them when real adversity struck. If you wish to be unbroken by adversity, he said, begin by practicing it before it comes. The Stoic must learn to see every setback as a stepping stone, every rejection as a redirection, every loss as a lesson in letting go. The man on the cliff takes a deep breath, steadies himself against the wind and whispers, "I will not fall." In that moment, he understands that what has been lost does not define him, that what has been taken does not diminish his worth, that the ground beneath his feet may crumble, but the ground within, his resolve, his character, his will to rise, remains solid and unbreakable. Seneca taught that the Stoic life was not a life without suffering, but a life in which suffering was used as fuel, as a forge, as the fire that tempered the steel of the soul. And so the man turns away from the cliff, his jaw set, his eyes fierce. A man who has been broken but not defeated, a man who has lost much but gained more, a man who has faced the storm and chosen to rise. Epictetus, the slave who became a philosopher, taught that the true test of character was not in moments of triumph, but in moments of loss, failure, and rejection. Difficulties show what men are, he said, and while others flee from the heat, the Stoic steps into the fire. Imagine a man whose life has just fallen apart. His business has failed, his friends have abandoned him, and the weight of rejection presses down like a suffocating fog. He sits alone in a dimly lit room, his head in his hands, his mind a storm of shame and self-doubt. But Epictetus would not pity this man. He would challenge him. "What will you do now?" he would ask. "Will you crumble or will you rise?" Epictetus believed that every setback was a test, a trial designed to reveal the strength or weakness of the soul. "If you wish to improve, be content to be thought foolish and stupid," he said, urging his students to embrace the sting of rejection as a necessary step in the journey of self-mastery. For Epictetus, setbacks were not curses but opportunities to practice detachment, to let go of the need for approval, to remain calm and composed even when the world seemed to turn against them. "Remember," he said, "you are not what happens to you but what you choose to become." The Stoic must learn to separate their worth from their circumstances, to see rejection not as a verdict on their value, but as a momentary event that holds no power except what they choose to give it. Epictetus taught his students to practice premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils, to mentally rehearse the worst-case scenario and prepare themselves to face it without fear. When you are about to undertake any action, remind yourself of what kind of action it is, he said, and what may happen as a result. The man in the room lifts his head, his jaw clenched, his eyes fierce. He takes a deep breath and whispers to himself, "This is my test." In that moment, he understands that what has happened to him is not the end, but the beginning. A chance to prove that he can endure, that he can rise, that he can use every setback as a stepping stone to strength. For Epictetus, the Stoic life was not a life free from failure, but a life in which every failure was transformed into fuel, every rejection into resolve, every setback into a stage upon which the strength of the soul could be displayed for all to see. Seneca, who served as an advisor to one of Rome's most unpredictable and dangerous emperors, knew that the greatest weapon against life's setbacks was not power or influence, but perspective. "We suffer more in imagination than in reality," he said, reminding his followers that the mind could be both a sanctuary and a prison, a place of calm or a storm of chaos. Imagine a man whose life has been turned upside down. his reputation ruined, his career destroyed, his dreams shattered. He sits alone in a darkened room replaying every mistake, every missed opportunity, every moment of failure. The voices in his head whisper like cruel specters, each one a reminder of what he could have been, what he should have done, what he will never achieve. But Seneca, who faced exile, disgrace, and near execution, understood that the real battle was not fought against circumstances, but against the mind's tendency to dwell in the past and project fears into the future. We are more often frightened than hurt, he said, and we suffer more in imagination than in reality. Seneca taught that the Stoic must learn to separate what is real from what is imagined, to distinguish between the actual event and the stories the mind creates around it. Do not torment yourself with what may never happen, he said, for it is not the present that disturbs us, but our thoughts about the present. The man in the room takes a deep breath, closing his eyes, and begins to question the thoughts that swirl through his mind like a storm. Is this truly the end? He asks himself. Or is it the beginning of something new? Seneca advised his followers to practice the art of detachment, to step back from their own suffering and observe it as if it were happening to someone else. This practice, known as the view from above, was a mental exercise in which one imagined rising above the earth and looking down upon one's own life as a detached observer, seeing the events as tiny, insignificant specks in the grand scheme of time. What is the harm in losing what is not yours to keep? Seneca asked, urging his students to release their grip on the past, to let go of the illusion of control, to see every setback as a fleeting moment that would pass as surely as the wind. The man in the room opens his eyes, the storm in his mind finally beginning to calm. He realizes that while he may have lost much, he has not lost himself, that while the world may reject him, he does not have to reject himself. And in that moment he begins to rebuild, not from the outside but from within, brick by brick, thought by thought, a new life constructed from the ashes of the old. Epictetus, the philosopher who rose from the chains of slavery to the heights of Stoic wisdom, believed that the true measure of a man was not in how he handled success, but in how he faced rejection and failure. If you want to improve, be content to be thought foolish and stupid, he said, urging his students to embrace the sting of criticism as a necessary step in the pursuit of self-mastery. Imagine a man who has just been publicly ridiculed, his every flaw exposed, his every mistake dissected for the world to see. He feels like a man stripped of all dignity, standing naked before a crowd that jeers and sneers, each insult a stone hurled at his fragile sense of self. But Epictetus, who had endured the humiliation of slavery, understood that true strength was not in avoiding criticism, but in remaining calm amidst it, in using it as a mirror to reflect back one's weaknesses and to identify where one still needed to grow. Who is your master? He asked. Anyone who has power over what you desire or fear. For Epictetus, the man who feared rejection was a slave, chained not by physical bonds but by the opinions of others. To free oneself, he taught, one must sever the chains of attachment to approval, to validation, to the desire to be liked or admired. If someone speaks ill of you, he said, remember that he does so from his own perspective, not from yours. The Stoic must learn to see criticism as a test, a challenge to practice self-restraint, to remain unmoved by the words of others, to respond with calm detachment rather than defensive anger. Epictetus advised his students to practice voluntary exposure to criticism, to seek out those who would point out their flaws without sugarcoating the truth, to learn to stand in the fire of judgment without flinching. When you are insulted, he said, do not merely restrain your tongue, but restrain your thoughts. The man in the crowd, still reeling from the sting of public humiliation, takes a deep breath and straightens his back. He realizes that the words of others hold no power except the power he chooses to give them, that their insults are nothing more than empty echoes carried on the wind. In that moment, he resolves to use every criticism as a lesson, every rejection as a stepping stone, every insult as a chance to practice the art of indifference. For Epictetus, the Stoic life was not a life free from criticism, but a life in which criticism became the training ground for self-mastery, a place where the soul was tempered, where the ego was humbled, where the man who had once feared the judgment of others now stood unshaken, unbroken, and invincible. Seneca once wrote, "A wise man is content with his lot, whatever it may be, without wishing for what he is not." Imagine a man standing amidst the ruins of what was once his life. The job he lost, the home he can no longer afford, the relationships that have withered away. The world around him is a landscape of broken dreams and shattered expectations, and in that moment he feels like a failure, a man who has been rejected by life itself. But Seneca, who had once been exiled from Rome and stripped of all his possessions, knew that the true measure of a man was not in what he owned, but in what he could endure without complaint. "It is not the man who has too little," he said, "but the man who craves more that is poor." For Seneca, setbacks and losses were not curses but opportunities to practice detachment, to sever one's identity from the things one could lose, to find peace in the realization that nothing external could ever truly belong to them. He advised his followers to practice voluntary poverty, to live for days on simple meals and coarse clothing, to sleep on the floor, to remind themselves that true wealth was not in material possessions, but in the mind that could endure their absence. "Set aside a number of days," he said, "during which you shall be content with the scantiest and cheapest fare, saying to yourself all the while, 'Is this the condition I feared?'" The Stoic must learn to strip away the illusions of security, to face the reality of loss, to stand amidst the ruins of their life and say, "I still remain." Seneca believed that the man who had learned to lose everything and still keep his calm was a man who had become invincible, a man who had transcended the power of fate, a man who could walk through fire and emerge unscathed. The man in the ruins takes a deep breath, his eyes scanning the wreckage of what once was, his heart heavy but his resolve unbroken. He whispers to himself, "I have lost much, but I have not lost myself." In that moment, he understands that his true wealth is not in the things he once possessed, but in the mind that can remain calm amidst chaos, in the spirit that can endure without bitterness, in the heart that can still find gratitude in the midst of loss. For Seneca, the Stoic life was not a life free from suffering, but a life in which suffering became the forge in which the soul was tempered. A life in which every setback was a step forward, every loss a chance to let go, every rejection a reminder that the only thing one truly owns is the mind that remains unbroken, unyielding, and at peace.